What if the woman they swore was just another, resisting suspect, turned out to be the one person who could end every badge in that city with a single phone call? Stay with me, because this story will make you rethink power, rethink justice, and rethink what happens when authority forgets who it's really dealing with. Subscribe now, because the next 5 minutes could change the way you see everything. The night was heavy with rain, the kind that blurred streetlights into streaks of gold and silver across the cracked pavement, as if the city itself was bleeding under the storm. Tires hissed against wet asphalt when a squad car rolled up behind a lone black SUV, lights exploding red and blue into the darkness. Inside that SUV sat a black woman, her posture calm, her eyes forward, hands resting neatly on the steering wheel. She knew what this was before the siren even wailed. She had lived through this script 1,000 times. But tonight, the script was about to tear itself apart. The officers approached with the swagger of men convinced of their authority, rain dripping off their caps, voices sharp, demanding papers, demanding obedience. She gave them everything by the book: license, registration, even the polite, "Yes, officer." But it wasn't enough. It never was. One reached for the door, yanking it open before she could even respond, dragging her out into the storm. "Stop resisting," he barked, though she wasn't resisting at all. His arm locked around her throat in a chokehold, the kind outlawed by their own department years ago. Her feet kicked against the ground, not from defiance but from the body's natural panic as air was stolen away. The rain plastered her hair to her cheeks, her nails clawing at his forearm as her vision tunneled. A crowd began to gather, phones out, voices rising in panic and outrage, the words, "Let her go." Cutting through the night, she fell to her knees, the officer's grip like iron, and for a heartbeat it seemed like she might fade into the dark, just another name added to a list that never stopped growing. But then, her eyes locked with the lens of one camera in the crowd, and something shifted. Even as she gasped, even as she struggled, there was a steel in her gaze, a silent warning to anyone who knew how to read it. Because she wasn't just anyone. She wasn't just another black woman choked on a rainy street for resisting. She was the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the most powerful law enforcement officer in the country. And though they didn't know it yet, the men choking her were already finished. The officer's arm dug deeper into her throat as the rain pooled around them, his partner shouting over the chaos, pushing the crowd back with one hand and brandishing his baton with the other. "Stay back," he roared, but the onlookers weren't moving. They were recording, their shouts cutting like thunder, and for once, the fear was no longer one-sided. One young man in a hoodie, phone held high, whispered to his friend just loud enough for the mic to catch, "Bro, that's not just anybody. I know her face. I swear that's her." The word sparked like an ember in dry grass, spreading through the crowd, carried from voice to voice, turning panic into electricity. A woman gasped, another shouted, and suddenly the chants weren't just, "Let her go," but, "Do you know who that is?" The officer choking her sneered through the rain, dismissing the noise as nothing but civilian interference, yet for the first time his grip faltered, not in strength, but in certainty. Because even he could feel it. The way her gaze, burning despite the lack of air, held more weight than any badge on his chest. Then it happened, the moment that would echo on every news broadcast in the world. A man shoved forward, risking the baton to thrust his phone into the officer's face, the screen glowing with an image from the FBI's own website, the official portrait of the director herself. The resemblance was undeniable, down to the sharp line of her jaw and the intensity of her eyes. "That's the director of the FBI." The man screamed, and though the cop barked back, "Get back." His voice cracked like glass under pressure. The partner froze, his baton trembling in his hand, the reality crashing through his arrogance like lightning. For the first time, their victim was not a victim at all. She was their superior, the one person who could not only strip them of their uniforms but put them in a cell darker than their nightmares. Still, the chokehold didn't release. Pride is a deadly thing, and fear often twists into stubbornness. He gritted his teeth, muttering, "She's resisting," as if the words could rewrite the truth unraveling before him. But in the shadows beyond the flashing lights, headlights appeared, sleek black SUVs sliding silently into the scene. Doors opened with mechanical precision, and figures stepped out. Suits, earpieces, men and women who moved not like ordinary agents but like wolves closing in on prey. The crowd parted instinctively, phones rising higher, capturing the storm as the bureau itself descended. No sirens, no shouting, just the heavy silence of power that doesn't need to announce itself. And as those agents advanced, their eyes locked not on the struggling woman, because they already knew who she was, but on the officers holding her. The storm outside was violent, but the storm about to break over those men would be something no weather could match. The officer's knuckles whitened around her throat as if clinging to control could reverse the avalanche already roaring toward him, but then the black-suited agents closed the distance, moving with the quiet certainty of predators who had been unleashed. One spoke, his voice flat, clipped, the kind of tone only heard from someone who carried orders carved into steel. "Release the director." Now. The cop blinked, rainwater dripping into his eyes, his partner's mouth hanging open, baton half raised but frozen midair. "Director," he muttered, as though the word itself were foreign, but the suits weren't here to explain. The lead agent lifted his hand, and in an instant, the scene exploded. Two agents seized the choking officer, wrenching him backward with such force that his body slammed into the hood of his cruiser, arms twisted and locked before he even understood he'd lost. The baton wielder swung wildly, desperate, but his weapon was plucked from his hand like a toy and hurled into the gutter. The woman collapsed to her knees, coughing, clutching her throat as oxygen clawed its way back into her lungs, but her eyes never left the men who had dared lay hands on her. Slowly, deliberately, she rose. The crowd roared, not just in anger, but in shock, disbelief, awe, every phone trained on her soaked figure, her hair plastered to her face, her presence radiating not fragility but fury. One agent slipped his coat around her shoulders, and even in that gesture, the crowd understood, this was no victim, this was command itself. The officer pinned to the cruiser thrashed, spitting curses, shouting, "She resisted. She resisted." But his words sounded hollow now, absurd against the tidal wave of evidence, against the hundreds of cameras capturing every breath. And then, as if the night hadn't shattered enough, the silence broke with the unmistakable thrum of helicopters overhead, their searchlights cutting down through the rain. News crews, national networks. This wasn't local anymore, this was history in real time. The director raised her chin, one hand lifting slightly, signaling her agents, and the two cops were dragged forward, shoved to their knees in the very puddles where they had forced her. "You think you understand power," she said, her voice raw but unbroken, carrying over the rain, over the chaos, steady as a blade. "But tonight, you learn who answers to who." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and one cameraman whispered into his live feed, "She's confirmed. It's her. The FBI director was assaulted tonight by city police officers." The nation was watching. The world was watching, and the two men kneeling in the rain knew, in their bones, that they weren't just losing their badges, they were about to be buried under the weight of the very system they thought they controlled. By dawn, the footage had already torn across every screen in America. Millions had watched the grainy livestream of rain, flashing lights, and a chokehold unravel into the most shocking reveal in modern history. The director of the FBI, brutalized on camera, rising in defiance while the men who attacked her were dragged away in chains. By morning, hashtags thundered across the digital landscape, hashtag "She is the director," hashtag "Justice in plain sight," hashtag "Power revealed." In every newsroom, anchors spoke her name with the kind of reverence reserved for legends, while in precincts across the country, officers watched the replay in silence, some with shame, others with fear, all realizing the rules had changed overnight. But the story wasn't finished. Because in America, justice doesn't end on the street. It drags itself into courtrooms, into hearings, into the halls of power where truth is tested against spin. And when the trial began, the world tuned in again. The two officers, now stripped of uniform and dignity, sat shackled before a federal judge, their lawyers grasping at every straw, claiming mistaken identity, claiming adrenaline, claiming fear. But the prosecution needed only one witness, her. The director entered that courtroom not in uniform but in the same simple black suit she had worn the day she was sworn in, her throat still bruised, her voice rough but unshaken. "They told the world I was resisting," she said, her eyes never leaving the men who had tried to choke the life from her. "What I was resisting was injustice. What I was resisting was a lie that has cost too many lives to count." The jury's faces were stone, the crowd behind her silent, the cameras drinking in every syllable. She turned, her voice rising now, not in rage but in certainty. And now the truth resists them. The defense sputtered, objected, clawed for footing, but it was over before it began. Guilty on all counts, sentencing swift and severe, and as the gavel came down, the image that swept the globe was not of her attackers broken, but of her standing, head high, bruises visible, but power radiating from her like fire through the dark. Congress scrambled, hearings erupted, reforms long delayed were dragged screaming into motion, and though the fight against corruption would never truly end, one truth had been written in lightning across the sky: you never know who you're choking in the rain. You never know who holds the power you think you own. And for the director of the FBI, the night that began as another act of violence became the night she reminded the world that justice, no matter how suffocated, will always breathe again. And that, my friends, is why this story isn't just entertainment. It's a warning, a revelation, a reminder that power hides in plain sight, and arrogance is always one breath away from collapse. If this shook you, if it made your pulse race, if it made you rethink everything about authority, then hit that subscribe, because the next story waiting for you will break the ground even harder.